Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome. I wanted to do a quick training for you guys because I put out a post the other day and I said, "Hey, I found the cure to common sense." And everyone was like, "What is it? I want to know because nobody has common sense anymore." So I'll tell you the short answer. The short answer is that the cure for common sense is actually a training system. So, Andrew, that sounds boring and uninteresting, but let me tell you why that is actually the answer. Because think about it this way: common sense isn't very common to someone who hasn't done something before. So think about it this way: when you have a new employee that's starting in and maybe they've never mopped a floor before, what's common sense for you, the way in which you mop that floor, is because you've been doing it for years, you've been trained, you've been taught, you've done it the wrong way, you've done it the right way. It's like second nature to you. But for someone never doing that before, that's not going to be common sense. That's totally new information. And so, what we have to understand is that when we talk about common sense, what we're actually referencing is someone who has had shared experiences and shared learnings similar to ours. So that means if you find someone who's had the exact same experience as you, has been educated in the same way, who's had the same jobs as you, their beliefs, their actions, their sense of common sense is going to be similar to yours. But guess what? In most of the cases, when we're hiring, we are hiring people that are 20 years younger than us. The way things were when we grow up are a lot different from the way that when they grew up or when they are growing up. So that doesn't mean that they don't have common sense, but their version of common sense and our version of common sense is just very, very different. So, another example of this, they could probably use social media way better than I can. They probably know how to do things on different platforms that I didn't even know exist. And that's totally common sense to them, but it's not common sense for us. Another way to look at it is if you have parents which are in the say 60 to 80 range, if you try to teach them how to use a computer, how to use smartphones, how to do things like that, how to use Facebook and social media, what's common sense to you isn't really that common for them, right? It takes a lot more. I mean, the amount of calls I've heard of like, oh, how do I change the channel on the TV again? Or how do I get that to record? Or why won't it go onto the Facebook? And so the amount of times I've heard that, it just kind of made me realize that common sense is not common because we don't come from a shared experience based on where we grew up, based on our ages, based on countries, education, all sorts of things can make that. So the real reason that we have to do this is because if we want something to be common sense with our team, we need to train them on it and we need to continue to enforce it into them so that it becomes common sense and becomes routine. So that's the reality that we're dealing with. So you have people that aren't measuring up. In all likelihood, you either didn't hire the right people or you didn't train them properly. It's usually one or the other. So let's dive into this a little bit. So the three-step training method is something that I teach my team, and it's something that I teach my clients. And so it's very, very simple. What we have to do is we have to show them what to do. We have to tell them why it's important, and then we need to follow up. So I'm going to walk you through these three steps. So you can write this down. You can screenshot this if you want. But number one, we have to show them how to do something. So when we're showing someone how to do something, we're not like, oh, well, you just wipe this down and then it's good. We actually have to show them. And then we have to say, okay, why don't you demonstrate that? Okay, great. And then you get them to practice it to ingrain that habit because we all know that our brains only retain about 10% of what's told to us. So realistically, how many times does someone have to do something and say something and hear something in order for it to really get inside their brain? Usually about 10 times. So that's why we want to instill practicing in what we're doing. So number one, you have to show them how to do something very clearly, very concisely, get them to repeat it back, get them to practice it. Now, number two, we have to tell them why it is important because especially millennials and Gen Z and whatever generations after that, in my experience, a lot of people won't do things unless they know why it's important. They want to know why it's important that they should do it a certain way before they'll actually do it that way. And so that's the missing piece. Whereas there used to be a command and control management structure. So for people which were Gen X, baby boomers and so on, they used to be very much a, hey, I told you to do this. I'm your boss. So you do it like that. And that's the way the world worked. And you did it and you got a paycheck and you went home. The difference for millennials and Gen Z is we don't really want to do something unless we know why it's important, or we will not do it if we don't know why it's relevant, why it's important, why we should do it. The why is the important piece here. And this is what a lot of people miss. A lot of people say, well, I'm writing your paycheck, so just freaking do it. That doesn't fly anymore. That does not fly for millennials and Gen Z. So when we are telling them why it's important, here's how in depth we have to be with it. So here's an example from one of my restaurants. We have a sandwich station where we make sandwiches. We wear gloves when we're doing it. And what we end up doing is we end up, kind of opening up the bottom, taking veggies out, refilling the top and stuff like that. And so one of the things that gets missed is sanitizing underneath the handles. Sure, they sanitize the main surfaces, the doors, things like that, but sanitizing underneath the handles where the bacteria can just sit there and grow. So when I'm explaining this to someone, I'm like, hey, so just so you know, we got to make sure that we wipe underneath there, because guess what? After 2 hours, anything that's up there, whether it be, sauce, cheese, bacteria starts to double and grow. And all of a sudden, think about it this way. Every time you put your hand up there, and then you go and you refill something, guess what? You're putting bacteria all over those veggies. And then when you go and you make your food for your lunch, you're putting bacteria straight into your mouth. Do you want a big spoonful of bacteria? Probably not. So that's why we have to sanitize underneath. Another great example of this is wiping down the counters. That's one thing that seems to get missed for some reason. And so I'd say, hey, you know what? Do you know why we need to wipe down these counters so many times per day? And they're like, well, so it's clean. I'm like, yes, absolutely. But guess what people do? People put their elbows here. And guess what happens when they do that? Dead skin particles fall off. And then guess what happens? Someone opens the door, wind comes through. All of this dead skin is now going right onto all of our food. And so when you make that pita for yourself, when you make that for your grandparents, all of a sudden, everyone's dead skin is just floating into your food. Do you want to have that happen to you? And at this point, they're like, no, I don't. So that's when we say, hey, this is why it's important to do it. So that is the tell them why portion. And by using stories like that, it can actually really get it to sink into their head. And so then what I'll do after is I'll say, okay, tell me now why it's important. I'll get them to repeat it back. So I've said it, made a story, got them to put themselves in that situation mentally, and then I get it to repeat it back to me. And then that has a much better chance of actually getting it to sink into their heads. So now we're on to the third step. So again, we've got show them how, tell them why. Number 3 is follow up. And here is the secret. The follow up never ends. The follow up never ends. So there's this thing called Parkinson's Law. So it's my second point here. Parkinson's Law states that we as humans are naturally procrastinators. How many times have you had things that were due in school and you waited until a few days before to get started on it, or a paper that is due at midnight, even though you had 3 weeks to work on it, you didn't really start doing it until later? Humans naturally do this. We naturally procrastinate on a lot of things. And so Parkinson's Law basically states that we will basically extend or shorten the time it takes us to do certain things based on the time allotted. So what that means is if I'm coming into your business and I'm saying like, hey, Andrew, we need to prep these 3 cambros of tomatoes, but you know what? It's been super slow. Just make sure it's done the next couple hours and then we're good. So you're going to go and you're going to do your thing. You're going to be a little bit, not moving super fast. You're just going to go at whatever pace. You're probably going to check your phone more often. You're probably going to do other things because there's no time pressure. But if I said, hey, Andrew, I need you to prep these 3 cambos of tomatoes in the next 20 minutes because we've got to fill them up front. We got customers coming in. We're not going to have time later. I need you to go right now. You are going to do it faster. You are going to adapt how you work to fit that time slot. So when we're talking about training, what we actually need to do is make sure that we are establishing those boundaries and expectations for people, because common sense would say, yeah, if I give you a task, do it as fast as you can. But in reality, we humans are procrastinators. So that might be common sense to us, but is not common sense to someone who we are not holding accountable to something. So when we train them, number 1, we need to make sure expectations are clear, and we have to follow up because people are procrastinators. So let me ask you a question. So in the past, you were probably in school at one point, and you probably had to turn in homework, probably had to turn in assignments, probably had to turn in essays, things like that, right? So, do you think you would have done things as well if you knew that no one was ever going to grade them and no one was ever going to check over what was done and it wasn't even going to matter? Hey, you have to submit these 100 different things by the end of the semester, but we're not going to grade them. They don't count for anything. No one is even going to look at them. Do you think you would put in as much work as you would have if you knew someone was going to grade them and be specific? So that's the question we have to ask ourselves. So if you put yourself in the shoes of your team members, generally speaking, minimum wage, entry level positions, um, if they don't think anyone's ever going to check over their work, are they going to do it to 110% of the standard that you want? Probably not, right? If no one ever comes and checks over their work, people will naturally get away with a little bit less. It is just human nature. So part of what we have to do is make sure that we are holding people accountable to these things. So part of the training is setting those expectations and following up to make sure that it is done on time and properly. And that is our role as managers. And I'm sure some of you guys are thinking, well, that is a waste of time. I shouldn't have to do it, but the reality is that for a lot of people, we do have to do it. So now, what I will tell you is that when you have the right people, you have to do that a lot less. So now I want to ask you a question. The people in your business right now, if you feel like you need to constantly monitor them, they're never doing things right, they're never getting it done on time, the question we then need to start to ask is, do you have the right people? Because sometimes if you don't have the right people, your training program can be amazing. But if they're still the wrong people, it's not going to matter. It's not going to turn them into amazing employees, right? Because you're not starting with a good base. So what we have to understand is that if you have amazing training that walks through everything perfectly, and you're holding people accountable, and you're giving proper deadlines, and you're doing all of that part, then we can start to ask the question is if you have the right people. So the example I use for this is, say if we needed a task done, but it's not written down anywhere. It's not clearly stated that something needs to be done. Well, we need to fix that first. If we didn't train them properly on doing it, we can't really expect them to do it properly if we've never trained them. And if we don't hold them accountable and make sure that they are aware that that's an expectation and that we will be holding them accountable for it, we also can't expect them to do it. But once we do those three things, then we can start to ask the question is, are they the right people? Then I view that the ball is in their court, and whether they do it or not is up to them. And then if they don't, then we move down the disciplinary tract and we start to do warnings with ultimately, moving them off and sending them to our nearest competitor or promoting them to customers, I like to joke. So that's basically the process that we have to follow. But if we haven't done our part, it's an unfair expectation for them. So we need to fix those things first. So now to sum up, where did common sense go in the world? We know that common sense does not actually exist, and there's no way that you will ever find that. The only way to put common sense in your business is to train people what that common sense is that you want them to know. And how we do that is by the 3-step training method: show them how, tell them why, follow up. Parkinson's Law means that people will naturally take as much time as you allow them, and they will do things as well as you basically hold them accountable to. So one of the keys here is you get what you tolerate. So people don't rise to the level of your expectations. They fall to the level of your accountability. So if you're not holding people accountable, that's where your standards are going. And then the last question is, once we do those things, then we can start to assess if we have the right people. And if not, then we need to find a way to bring in and identify better team members. And so that when we combine that with an amazing training program, that's where we get the common sense and results that we need in our business moving forward.